Most people think mental strength looks like discipline. Waking up at 5 a.m., cold showers, grinding through pain with a smile. That's not mental strength, that's performance. Real mental strength has a signature that looks nothing like what self-help culture sells you. And neuroscience is starting to explain why the traits that make people uncomfortable around you, the detachment, the silence, the refusal to react, aren't personality flaws. They're evidence of a prefrontal cortex that learned to override your limbic system under conditions most brains would never survive. Let's get into it. Number 10. You don't react to provocation. Not because you're passive, because your anterior cingulate cortex is running a cost-benefit analysis faster than the other person can finish their sentence. Most people hear an insult and their amygdala fires, cortisol spikes, fight or flight. That's the default mammalian response. But your dorsal anterior cingulate, the region responsible for conflict monitoring, intercepts the emotional signal before it reaches motor output. Research on the anterior cingulate and medial prefrontal cortex shows dorsal caudal ACC regions handle appraisal of negative emotion, while ventral rostral regions regulate limbic responses. In mentally strong individuals, this ventral regulation dominates. Your brain doesn't suppress the emotion, it reroutes it. The insult registers, but your prefrontal cortex already calculated that reacting costs more than it gains. The person calling you cold is watching a brain that processes threats 3 steps ahead of theirs. Number 9. You cut people off without guilt. Sounds ruthless. It's actually intact threat prediction circuitry. Your ventromedial prefrontal cortex maintains a running model of every relationship, expected emotional return versus actual emotional cost. When someone consistently violates that model, your brain flags them like a recurring environmental threat. The difference? In most brains, the subgenual anterior cingulate generates guilt signals that override the threat assessment. You still feel the pull, but your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex overrides it. You cut them off because your brain refuses to allocate resources to a relationship returning negative value. Neuroscience calls this social resource optimization, the same circuit that kept ancestors alive by cutting costly alliances. That's not cruelty, that's computational efficiency. Number 8. You function well in crisis, but collapse afterward. During acute stress, your locus coeruleus floods your forebrain with norepinephrine, the brain's emergency broadcast system. A 2025 review in the European Journal of Neuroscience confirmed the LC norepinephrine system is the primary mediator of the acute stress response, with direct projections to the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus. In mentally strong individuals, this system is calibrated differently. Norepinephrine hits the prefrontal cortex at optimal levels, the sweet spot of the Yerkes-Dodson curve. You think clearly, act decisively, look superhuman. Then the crisis ends. Your HPA axis crashes. Cortisol plummets, the norepinephrine withdrawal hits like a power outage. You're not weak for collapsing after. Your brain ran a neurochemical sprint that most systems would have shut down during. Number 7. You remember every mistake you've ever made. Not rumination, adaptive error monitoring. Your dorsal anterior cingulate generates an error-related negativity, an electrical signal firing within 100 milliseconds of a mistake. The ACC functions as the brain's conflict detection device, monitoring discrepancies between intended and actual outcomes. In most people, this signal fades. In your brain, it encodes into long-term procedural memory through hippocampal consolidation. You don't just remember the mistake, you remember the exact decision sequence that caused it. This is why you rarely repeat errors, and why you lie awake at 3 a.m. replaying a conversation from 2019. Your brain treats every social error as survival data. The cost is insomnia. The benefit is a prediction engine most brains never build. There are certain signs of deep mental strength that don't look the way you'd expect. They aren't about motivational posters or relentless positivity. In fact, to others, they can look dark, unsettling. Let's explore 6 of these signs, starting with number 6. You're comfortable being alone for extended periods. For most people, solitude is a threat signal. Their brain's social monitoring network generates distress when social input drops too low. It's an evolutionary alarm to keep us in groups. But your brain has recalibrated that threshold. Your default mode network runs self-referential processing so deep it can actually substitute for external social input. Research on resilience has found that stronger connectivity between the brain's attention network and this default mode network enhances psychological resilience. Your solitude isn't antisocial. It's your brain maintaining the very architecture that makes you resilient. Number 5. You make decisions that upset people and you don't change course. When others disagree, their disapproval activates your anterior insula, the region that processes social pain. In most brains, this triggers a course correction, but your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex holds the original decision in working memory, and it refuses to update based on emotional feedback alone. This is the same architecture that allows neurons to maintain information while resisting interference. Essentially, your brain treats social disapproval as noise, not signal. People call this arrogance. Your brain calls it signal integrity. Number 4. You feel emotions intensely, but nobody knows. Your amygdala generates emotional responses at full intensity, but your ventral anterior cingulate and ventromedial prefrontal cortex contain the expression before it ever reaches your face, your voice, or your body. Research shows this negative coupling between these prefrontal areas and the amygdala is the neural signature of emotion regulation. Your brain doesn't feel less, it contains more. You're burning cognitive fuel at a rate that would exhaust most people, and nobody sees it, because the whole point is invisibility. Number 3. You prepare for worst-case scenarios obsessively. This isn't anxiety, it's defensive pessimism with a neurological basis. Your brain runs threat simulations through the anterior cingulate amygdala circuit. But unlike in clinical anxiety, where these simulations loop endlessly without resolution, your prefrontal cortex attaches a concrete action plan to each scenario. The simulation completes. The contingency gets stored. Research on prefrontal plasticity shows stress remodels our neurons. But in resilient people, this remodeling is adaptive. Your neurons aren't shrinking, they're reorganizing. You're not catastrophizing, you're pre-computing solutions. Number 2, you forgive, but you permanently change how you interact with that person. Your brain maintains a person model, a prefrontal representation of their expected behavior. When someone betrays that model, your anterior cingulate generates a prediction error. The model updates. Forgiveness then happens in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which reassigns the emotional value. You genuinely do forgive, but the updated model persists in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You interact differently not because you're punishing them, but because your brain simply cannot run the old prediction model. It was overwritten. People might think you're being passive-aggressive. Your brain is being computationally honest. And number 1, you've been through something that should have broken you, and you function normally. This is the one that scares people. Research on neuroplasticity in PTSD shows trauma modifies the brain. In most, this remodeling is destructive. The amygdala hyperactivates, the hippocampus shrinks, the prefrontal cortex loses connections. But in a subset of people, the remodeling reverses. The prefrontal cortex reorganizes itself. Dendritic branching increases. Connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala strengthens. Your brain doesn't just survive the trauma, it uses it as building material. The architecture you're running right now was constructed from the very thing that was supposed to destroy you. That's why people can find you unsettling. Not because you're damaged, but because you function at a level that implies you've processed something they can't even imagine, and your brain came out of it running a more advanced operating system. That's not resilience as a motivational poster. That's stress-induced neuroplastic reorganization, the darkest sign of mental strength there is. That's all for today. If this changed how you see yourself, subscribe. More like this is coming.